Hello, I'm Tom Booker, Senior Instructor. Thank you for joining me. This is our Warrior Personal Strength lesson on Indomitable Spirit. And today we will be talking about how Fred claims his liberty. Fred waited in jail in Easton for another week with only the slave traders for company. They talked and joked about how hard life was working in the cotton fields far to the south, and what a high price they would get for him there. Fred didn't say much. He dreaded being sold south, but he wasn't going to show it to the slave traders. At the end of the week, Thomas Auld came to the jail, signed Fred's release papers, and took him back to St. Michael's. He scolded Fred for all the trouble he had caused for everyone, especially for Thomas. He grumbled that he ought to sell Fred to a friend of his with a big cotton plantation in Alabama. It would serve Fred right if he did just that. But instead, he sent Fred back to Hugh and Sophia in Baltimore. Before he left, Thomas had a serious talk with Fred. He said that if Fred would stay out of any more trouble and learn a skilled trade so that he could support himself out on his own, Thomas would free him once he turned 25. Well, when he returned to Baltimore, Fred became an apprentice caulker in the shipyards. A caulker was a skilled worker who sealed the gaps between the wooden planks of a sailing ship's hull. This kept the hull watertight when the ship was at sea. As an apprentice, Fred was a student learning the craft by assisting skilled, experienced caulkers. Fred learned to wedge cotton and oakum in between the planks with a heavy caulking iron, and then to seal it in place with hot pitch. After about a year, Fred completed his apprenticeship and became a journeyman caulker. He could now work in any shipyard in Baltimore. On a really good week, when there was plenty of work in the yards, he could make as much as $9. Most of the friends he made now were free, but he was still a slave. Thomas Auld had promised to free him when he turned 25, but that was still over 5 years away. That thought bothered Fred more and more. Many things could happen in 5 years. He might get into trouble at his work in the shipyards. He'd had a few run-ins with bullies who tried to make him quit or get him fired. Hugh might get angry with him and send him back to Talbot County. Thomas might go back on his promise. He might even die. What good would his promise be then? Fred never forgot just how close he had come to being sold south. As long as he remained a slave, he would be in danger. Fred thought his situation through carefully. He liked living in Baltimore and the friends he had made there. He could work at his trade, try to stay out of trouble, and hope to be freed by Thomas in another 5 years. But that was risky. Or he could take matters into his own hands and claim his liberty. He could escape north to Philadelphia, or even further to New York. That was risky too. If he was caught a second time, Fred was certain that he would be sold south to the cotton fields. Whatever he decided would mean taking risks and facing dangers. There was no completely safe course open to him. When he was still trying to make up his mind, Fred got into an ugly quarrel with Hugh Auld. Fred had gone to a big revival meeting one weekend with his friends and hadn't told Hugh he would be away. Hugh was furious when he got back. He let Fred know in no uncertain terms that he was still a slave and couldn't come and go as he pleased. He grounded Fred and made him turn in all the money he earned in the shipyards. Fred refused to work. Then Hugh started dropping hints about all the work he could find for Fred down south in the cotton fields. Fred made up his mind quickly after that. He resolved to take his chances and escape. He set September 3rd as the date. That gave him only 3 weeks to plan and make all the arrangements. But Fred was convinced he had to act swiftly. The longer he took about this, the more danger he would be in. But he also needed to come up with a solid, workable plan that he had the ability and the resources to carry through. Fred had attempted escape once before and had failed. He couldn't afford to fail again. He would learn from his mistakes the first time to succeed the second. First, Fred went back to work. He turned in all the money he earned to Hugh. He didn't complain that it was unfair. He was careful not to provoke Hugh. Fred wasn't going to do or say anything that would start another quarrel. Fred kept his plans as secret as he could. He remembered vividly how he and his friends had been betrayed. But he couldn't manage his escape all on his own. He had to have help. He took only a very few of his closest friends into his confidence. One was Anne Murray, and another was Isaac Rolls. They were people he could trust to both help him prepare and to hold the secret of his escape as tightly as he did himself. The day came, September 3rd. Fred put his plan into action. He would escape on the new railroad from Baltimore to Philadelphia. He disguised himself as a sailor, wearing a red shirt, a black neckcloth, and a tarpaulin hat. Isaac drove Fred to the station in his dray. Fred jumped on board at the last minute as the train was pulling out of the station. It would take him north through Maryland and Delaware to Philadelphia. At least Fred hoped it would. First, he would have to buy his ticket from the conductor. If the conductor suspected that Fred was an escaping slave, he would turn him into the bounty hunters at the next station. Fred wasn't relying just on his disguise. He also had a seaman's protection certificate to prove that he was a professional merchant seaman and a U.S. citizen. No slave would have something like that. Fred could also sound like a sailor. He had picked up many seafaring words like starboard and avast from working in the shipyards. Fred had been given the Seaman's Protection Certificate by a retired sailor named Stanley. The certificate didn't have his picture on it, but it did describe what Stanley looked like. Fred looked very different. For a start, he was much younger. If the conductor looked at the certificate carefully, he would spot Fred as an imposter. The conductor was busy collecting fares and checking tickets. When he got to Fred, he barely glanced at his seaman's protection. He took Fred's money, gave him his ticket, and went on to the next passenger. Fred still needed his sailor disguise. The train trip went on for several more hours. He was scared every last minute of it. He spotted a blacksmith he knew slightly from Baltimore riding in the same car. The smith looked at him sharply a few times and then looked away, as though he recognized Fred's face but couldn't remember who he was or how he knew him. Fred waited for him to say something, but he never did. On the ferry boat across the Susquehanna River, someone did recognize him. A deckhand on the ferry named Nichols knew him right away and was full of questions. Where was Fred going? Why was he dressed up like a sailor? Nichols was friendly and he didn't mean any harm, but he was starting to attract attention. Fred said as little as possible and slipped away into the crowd of other passengers as soon as he could. After the ferry ride, Fred boarded another train to take him on to Wilmington, Delaware. At a station on this leg of the trip, he saw someone else he knew, a ship captain named McGowan. All McGowan had to do was turn his head, and he would see Fred. Then he would be caught. But McGowan never so much as glanced at Fred. From Wilmington, Fred took a steamboat up the Delaware River to Philadelphia, but he didn't plan to stay. Philadelphia was just too close to Baltimore, and there were too many bounty hunters on the watch for escaped slaves. From the steamboat wharf, he walked quickly to the train station and boarded another train north for New York. He arrived in New York at dawn on September 4th. He was a complete stranger there. He didn't know anyone. He was tired, hungry, homeless, and almost broke. As a fugitive slave, he was a permanent exile from his own home, from everything and everyone he had ever known. He could never go back. But Fred had done it. Despite all the risks, he had escaped. He had claimed his liberty, and he meant to keep it. Now, we've got some questions about Fred and Indomitable Spirit. The first of them, the slave traders talked and joked about how hard life would be for Fred in the cotton fields far to the south. Fred dreaded being sold south, but he wasn't going to show that to the slave traders. He didn't respond to their taunts. Was Fred facing them with indomitable spirit? Or should he have begged them for mercy? Or yelled at them that he wasn't afraid of them? Second question. Should Fred have stayed in Baltimore and hoped that things would all work out on their own, and that Thomas would keep his promise and free him when he turned 25? Do you think that would have taken indomitable spirit? Last question. When Fred escaped by train, he was scared every minute of the trip that someone would recognize him and turn him into the bounty hunters. If he did succeed, he would be all on his own in New York, friendless, homeless, and broke. Did seeing it through and claiming his liberty help Fred develop indomitable spirit as his personal strength? I'd like you to think about those questions. See if you can answer at least one of them and send the answer along to me by email. Thank you very much for joining me.